I love skills. When it comes to creating a character and deciding what your character is good at and what they're not so good at, skills is a fantastic way to represent that. But did you know, in first edition, basic D&D, there were no skills? Wow, I tell a little bit of a lie. You had thief skills. You had to be the thief class or a couple of other classes that gained access to them. And they started at a low percentage and went slowly up from there as you gained the levels. By the time you reached 9th, 10th level, you were fairly competent in your skills. And of course, the only other skills you had were within the DMG, where the Dungeon Master could roll on a table and decide what your secondary skill was, to liven up your character, give it a bit of background, a bit of history, and to bring something else into the game. Your attributes pretty much decided what you did. If you were strong, you could do feats of strength more easily, have more chance of success than someone who wasn't as strong. Same with dexterity and all the other attributes. You would decide what you want to do, and then the DM would make a call. What attribute is used, and if there were any modifiers. Is it easy or is it difficult? You then made an attribute check, rolling a d20 and getting your attribute value or lower to succeed. It put your imagination at the forefront. Your character could do anything you imagined. It was a great level of freedom, but not without its issues. You were at the whim of inconsistent calls by your Dungeon Master, or sometimes perceived favoritism, where you seem to always have penalties, but another player always has bonuses, increasing their chance of success. It was not easy for new players to adopt. Many a time I've sat at the table where a new player, having heard about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, this mystical game that will change their lives forever, sits there, it is their turn to act, and they go, "What can I do?" And everybody at the table just goes, "Well, whatever you want to do." And they look down at their character sheet, there's not much help there. They look at each of the players and at the DM, and the DM reassures them, "Look, whatever you imagine you can do, you can do." But they don't know where to begin. They flounder, and so long as they can get past that, a beautiful fantasy world opens up before them. But I have seen many new players fall at that first hurdle, not knowing what their character can do. It is also not easy for a player to argue their corner. They believe that their action should use one attribute, and the DM believes it should use a completely different one. There's no guidance here. You have to go with what the DM decides. And sometimes that can feel like the DM is picking on you, especially when the calls keep going against you. A favoured attribute you thought would be used is not, and one that is not so great is constantly being used. You would also have that player who came up with the brilliant idea, some plan that worked. The DM makes a call thinking, "Wow, that would be so cool," and the player gets away with doing something so incredibly magnificent and powerful. And then they do it again, and then they do it again, and then they keep doing it. All because it succeeded the first time, and it yielded such great results. As much as you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do, whatever you can imagine, not having a well-defined character, only 6 attributes to really work with, means that at times you can't visualize how good your character is at doing something, or calculate the risk. You want to do something daring in combat for a big bonus, and instead you end up on your arse, you end up in a worse position. I have seen this happen. Combats become stagnant. No one wants to try anything. They're too scared. The DM keeps making a call that does not favour the players. The players shut down. I have been there when tables have descended into arguments over inconsistent calls. It all came down to the Dungeon Master. And if you had a Dungeon Master that made consistent calls time and time again, you would feel that it was fair. As much freedom as you have, every time you make a call, the Dungeon Master has to decide how to interpret that call. And this can lead to fatigue. The Dungeon Master's been bombarded time and time again. There's not much guidance because they're the ultimate arbiter of what can be achieved or not. And it is constant. The Dungeon Master begins to feel tired. The story feels like it's secondary compared to the constant, minute calls being made to resolve one action or another. Sometimes actions that don't really impact anything, but the player has no other means of being able to do what they do other than say, "I'd like to do this, can I?" As much freedom as you had, it was far from perfect, but it was a great start. And then there was the arrival of of 2nd edition. You had a reappearance of the thieving skills, but this time you didn't have a table to lock you into your values. You were given a bit more freedom. You had percentile points to spend. You could focus in one area or another at the expense of the others, making sure that even at first level you were decent in those areas. You still had your 6 attributes, and they were still tied back to doing things that the rules didn't cover. And you also had your secondary skills you could roll up, adding a bit more background. But what you got in 2nd edition were proficiency slots, weapon proficiencies and non-weapon. Your weapon proficiencies provided training on weapons. You would have to pick each weapon individually, although rules came out later on to group weapons together. And if you used a weapon you weren't proficient with, you'd have a penalty based on your class. For the straight fighters, they could specialize, gaining additional bonuses to hit, damage, and additional attacks. But what 2nd edition really brought in were non-weapon proficiencies, and these were the first skills you had to start defining your character. You would start with a number of these proficiencies, and then after gaining a certain number of levels, you would gain another proficiency, either a weapon or non-weapon, and sometimes both. Warriors, for example, would gain a weapon and non-weapon every 3rd level. Your non-weapon proficiency points could be used to purchase a whole plethora of skills. You all had access to general, and then you only had access to the ones under your class. For the first time, your character was more than just the combat stats and attributes. There were certain skills that they had, that they were trained in, that they could use in the game. There were rules around the use of these skills. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect, far from it. Sometimes the description within the skills was so open to interpretation, you were still back at the whim of the DM, who decided whether the skill could be used in that capacity or not, or whether there was a further penalty or not. But it was definitely a step in the right direction. The player now had an understanding. What could my character do? And when they came across a document, an ancient text, and the dungeon master says you don't understand it, they can turn around and say, but I understand these ancient languages. Is it one of these? One of the drawbacks to this is that players now started to look at their character sheet a lot more. What can my character do according to my sheet, rather than looking at the battle map or looking at the situation and going, what do I want my character to do? It kind of made more sense though, in my opinion. A character who is good at a certain skill, for example, disguise, may look when infiltrating an organization to disguise themselves rather than use stealth or subterfuge, as that is where their strength is. I really love 2nd edition, and I felt the non-weapon proficiencies especially brought a much needed definition to characters. They were the start of real skills. And then 3rd and 3.5 came along, and boy did it change things. And now there was a whole set of defined skills. Wow, they were split down into the different classes, and certain classes only had access to certain skills. A little bit of a carryover from 2nd edition. Some could be used untrained, and others could only be used if you were trained. And then you had points you could spend based on your intelligence. The more intelligent you were, the more points you got to spend on all these skills. And then you got to put numbers on top of those skills. If you were trained in a skill and you put all the points you could at first level, it had a value of 4. And then you added your attribute to it. Wow, those numbers were getting bigger. And those numbers would continue to get bigger and bigger, which is a good thing. Unlike previous editions, you were no longer rolling against an attribute and trying to get that value or lower. You were now rolling against a difficulty class, a much bigger number, adding your skill value and your attribute and trying to get that number or higher. And these numbers could get high. You had to pour every point you had. You had to focus on your skills. At first level, they weren't fantastic. You would fail more often than you succeeded. But by the time you got to 10th level, you would be very, very competent, almost never failing. The constant increasing of your skill in accordance with your level meant that your skills were locked really behind your level rather than your training. You may have a background where you have studied history, but you're a first level character, which means the maximum points you can put in history is 4. For me, this felt a little bit odd. I prefer to have characters that have skills based on their experience. Their level is more around their survivability as an adventurer and their combat capabilities, the tools they have at their disposal, the power they wield when it comes to casting of spells. But 3rd edition had very detailed skills, and there were lots of numbers in here. It meant that when you wanted to use a skill, you were often going back to the player's handbook. You were having to trawl through, oh, what is my DC for doing what I'm trying to do? If you asked the DM, they would pause the game whilst they went back to the book and they started to trawl through. Is this a 15? Is this a 13? Is it 20? Oh my god, it's a 30. And he's only first level. He's more than likely going to fail, but let's give it a shot. I felt the pendulum had swung massively from one side to the other, from poorly defined characters that really didn't have much in the way of skills to proficiencies that were quite loose and open in their interpretation, to skills that are so well defined that you have to keep referring back to the book. There was no leeway for DM interpretation. Now the power was truly in the hands of the player. When you have good players around the table, that isn't a problem, but when you have power gamers, that can create a frustrating situation where you spend more time arguing with the player as to why, despite the skill actually saying that they should be able to do it, they can't. Diplomacy being a good example of this. Having that power gamer who, despite treating an NPC incredibly unfairly, causing them so much harm that they become incredibly hostile. But they have diplomacy, they've rolled that magic number, that NPC should now be friendly and ignore all that has happened before. It was frustrating. The skills were too well defined, the numbers were a wide range, the DCs were either very easy to achieve or very, very difficult, and the power gamer could easily exploit this system. And then along came 5th edition, and I will be honest, it was a breath of fresh air to begin with. The skills seemed elegant, nicely laid out. You would decide if you were trained in a skill or not, and it would go up automatically. So again, the development of the skill was still tied behind your level. It still used a number added to your attribute, but this number was far, far smaller. Whereas 3rd edition, you could start with a +4 in a skill. You could only have a +2 in 5th ed. It was a good move. It was much better than what 3rd edition had, and it developed far more on what 2nd edition had. The numbers were a lot smaller and more manageable, and the numbers didn't go up too much. And this was a double-edged sword. And that's one of the things I did not like about 5th edition. The skills, as good as they were, as streamlined as the numbers had become, it all came down to the dice roll. Now you were at the whim of the dice. If you rolled high, your skill would succeed. If you rolled low, it wouldn't. Your training only had a slight impact on that. And of course, your training was still locked behind your level. Focusing on one of the big positives about 5th edition, at least the DCs were fairly standard. But again, you had that 30 near impossible. But it kind of fitted. The number range meant that 30 was, short of having someone with expertise, was very, very difficult to achieve. When looking through the player's handbook, the descriptions of what skills could do was a little bit lacking. It was a bit too open. Whereas 3rd edition, everything was detailed. In 5th edition, very little was detailed. A general idea of what the skill can be used for, and then your dungeon master will decide on the difficulty class, the number you need to roll when using the skill to achieve what you're trying to achieve. This led to quite a comical situation where, in one of the rare games that I managed to play over the last few years, the dungeon master set a DC of 15 for us leaping over a small wall. Well, comedy ensued as we all, Monty Python style, attempted the roll, failing and tumbling over this wall, or rather bouncing off it, and then looking at the DM and going, well, we failed the roll, what next? Not having well-defined difficulty classes within each skill meant that you didn't have to keep referring back to the skills in the books, but it also meant the DM would suffer fatigue at having to constantly come up with a number. And if they weren't consistent in those numbers from situation to situation, players could quickly raise it. Last time we attempted this, you said it was a 15, and now you're saying it's a 20. Why? When you're behind that screen, and you're trying to keep the game moving at a steady pace, trying to keep the players engaged, the last thing on your mind is coming up with numbers. Numbers to represent how difficult a task is. All of this fed into my approach to Untold Destiny. I love skills, and the one thing I always felt, skills should not be beholden to your level. If you have a background where you become a master alchemist, then your skill in alchemy should be at a high rank, a rank of master. You should gain those benefits from 1st level onwards. Why is your level a representation of how sturdy, how much damage you can take, and how much power you have in combat? Why should that be a defining factor on how good you are at a skill? Your training within Untold Destiny is defined by how many d20s you roll. You just add your attribute to that, and all difficulty classes are 20 or higher. So if you are expert at athletics and you have a strength of 12, which is a +6 modifier, you would roll 2d20 and add 6 to the highest of those dice, needing a 20 or higher to pass. Of course, if it's an opposed skill, you now need to go against your opponent. So with all the DCs being 20, how do we adjudicate whether something's more difficult or easy? Well, that's simple. The boon and bane system. When someone decides to do something, they may say, I'm attempting to climb this tree. I think, well, it's a normal check to climb the tree. A tree's a tree. However, it has been raining. The branches are slippy. It's going to be a bit more difficult. You have a bane. Or it could have been snowing. There could be ice everywhere. You have a greater bane. On the flip side, the tree could be sturdy with lots of branches, making it easier to climb. You have a boon. Instantly, I'm no longer thinking of numbers behind the screen. I'm thinking of how easy or difficult a task is, and then adjudicating accordingly. This becomes a quick and easy way to resolve difficulties when a player wants to do something. And how does the boon or bane affect your roll? You either add a d6 or take one away. If it's a greater boon or greater bane, you add a d10 or take the d10 away from the result. When you're using a skill, your level of training really matters. The more d20s you roll, the more consistent you will be at achieving the higher numbers when using that skill. You're less reliant on the d20, you're more reliant on your skill. And of course, the boons and banes, either adding a d6 or taking one away or a d10, they can make the test a nail-biting affair. It works, and it works well. And the skill, open enough for the games master to use their own interpretation with a little bit of a guide, just to give them an indication of what is considered easy or difficult. And that is what they are, a guide, to help the games master understand whether something is easy or more difficult. They can then take into account any other situations, very quickly deciding, well, this should be a boon, but you know what? It's been raining, it's very slippery, it's now going to be a bane. I love skills. I think they define a character. They give your character a purpose in the world, strengths and weaknesses. They inform you as to what your character is good at, what they can excel at, and where they will not do so well, where they lack the training and knowledge. It helps you roleplay your character. It helps you understand how your character would react in certain situations. But if you want to play a nice simple system where it is your imagination that drives the game forward, and you have a GM or DM that loves running that game and can make those consistent calls, and it's engaging and you're enjoying yourself, then you go for it. But if you also love characters that are well defined with plenty of skills, with a purpose in the world, then again, go for it. For me, I love a well-defined character. I love skills.